Thank you. So my name is Robert Wilson. I'm the Director of Security Operations and Incident Response for what I now have to call U of SC. We're not allowed to call ourselves USC anymore. So that's a whole big question that we can talk about afterwards. So right up the road, up Interstate 20. So today I'm going to talk about LSASS, but first I wanted to tie this back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, just because anytime I give one of these talks, I want to kind of see what people know and whether or not they've heard about the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I think we're far enough along since it's been released where almost everyone does, but if there's anyone that's a student or they're switching into going to cybersecurity or whatever, tying things back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework allows us to work with a common taxonomy for tactics and techniques. So it allows my friend Kenny from Breach Quest is here, so I can go and talk to Kenny about credential dumping, and we'll all be talking about the same thing. So the specific technique and sub-technique that I'm going to talk about today is dumping LSASS memory. So I have to talk about Windows a little bit because this sub-technique that we're going to talk about, LSASS, is a Windows problem. So I'm going to tell you right off the bat, LSASS is way more complex than something like in Linux where you have etc password and etc shadow separated from each other. LSASS is a huge set of modules that do a bunch of different things, and protecting Windows is not easy at all. Just if you don't work, if you didn't come into this from being a system administrator, which I know a lot of people started off as sysadmins, Windows is complex. So I've actually spoken here a couple previous times about the Windows firewall and doing some event forwarding stuff. Windows has a lot of technologies that people might not be familiar with, but it also has a huge attack surface, and it's used pretty much everywhere. So almost everyone, if you're doing security stuff, you're going to run into protecting Windows. So one of the issues with it is that it's built for compatibility. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about are not turned on by default. Microsoft isn't going to help you unless you buy a certain license, which we'll talk about also. The other thing is the general this morning was talking about protecting 1.4 million endpoints, right? So combination of whatever it is, Linux, Windows, all that kind of stuff. Most organizations are not going to have 1.4 million endpoints, right? So my sister works at a law office in Camden. They have 5 machines, all Windows computers. They have no idea what LSASS is, and none of the things that I'm going to talk about are turned on in their environment. I can almost guarantee you. So if you do consulting work, or you work for an MSSP, or you're in an organization and you get into doing security architecture, LSASS is one of the most important things that you need to know and think about how it is that you can detect activities that happen against it, and then how you can turn on some preventive controls. So Windows, you know, Apple is a hardware company, and they can say, all right, we're not going to support this anymore, and it's gone. Microsoft almost never does that. So a lot of this technology is actually remnants of, you know, NT351 all the way to, you know, whatever it is now, 27 years later. So LSASS itself, it's part of the security authority, and the LSASS process mostly runs in user mode. So I'm not gonna read all these things, but LSASS can be thought of as basically a treasure chest that's running on your endpoint. And let me be specific that I'm going to talk about this from an endpoint perspective, meaning a workstation perspective and not a domain controller. So on your Windows endpoint, machine at home, if you run Windows, LSASS has access to all of these authentication providers. So they're going to have, Kerberos tickets are going to be in there, hashes, passwords, if you haven't turned off WDigest, all that stuff's going to be in there. That thing is the treasure chest for credentials. That is the thing where someone gets access to your machine. If they want to get credentials to do something like lateral movement, LSASS is the thing that they want to hit. So at a certain point in the kill chain, one of the things that you might want to do is grab credentials and then pivot using a credential that you've gotten from a machine. So in a domain environment, an LSASS attack, you want somebody to have logged in as a domain admin to a workstation. You dump LSASS memory, run some kind of tool, get credentials, and then make a lateral move. So I have to, anytime you talk about Windows, especially having to do with authentication, you have to mention, and I probably don't know how to pronounce his last name because I'm Southern, and I think it's Cyphus. So Steve Cyphus works for Microsoft and has for a long time. On Twitter, sometimes someone will ask him a question like, how does Kerberos work? And he will go on a 30 to 40 tweet thread about what is the history of why Microsoft picked Kerberos for authentication and go back to how did things get included in Windows 2000, all that kind of stuff. So if you're on Twitter, which I strongly recommend that you are if you're doing security stuff, Steve Cyphus is someone to follow. So why is it that we care about LSASS? In addition to the fact that it stores credentials, there is a French gentleman who wrote a tool several years ago in order to learn C, was his stated reason. So he learned a lot about Win32 APIs, the C language, all that kind of stuff, and wrote Mimikatz. So if you're in the SANS world, I guarantee you that you've run across this in 504. Mimikatz has been around a long time. Mimikatz has the capability of reading LSASS dump files. So is there anyone in here who does not know that you can dump memory from processes? Is that a pretty normal thing for y'all to get? Or is there anyone that's never heard of that concept? Okay, all right. So even if you don't feel comfortable admitting it, I didn't know about that, 10 years ago or whatever. So Mimikatz can read in those dump files. So this specific attack technique that we're talking about is use some thing, and there I'll give a couple of examples. Dump the memory of the LSASS process and read it into Mimikatz in order to get credentials. So, and then there's the other way to do it, which is basically to get direct process access to LSASS, but that hopefully would get caught faster. So Mimikatz, as I said, volatility, which is used for forensics purposes normally, but you can also use it in this case to get credentials. People are constantly writing new iterations of tools to do these attacks to get around signature-based and behavioral-based detections. There's a lot of them that are written in .NET right now. There's some PowerShell stuff that you can do in order to dump it. It's extremely easy if you have administrative rights to a computer, to a Windows computer. You go into Task Manager and you can create a process dump with LSASS for LSASS. You can also run sysinternals proc dump, drop the RAM out, sorry, not the RAM, the memory from the process. There's also some fairly unique things that came out a few years ago where there's a DLL that's comm services DLL, where you can use run DLL, run this comm services that makes a Win32 API call to mini dump, which will allow you to dump RAM. I can tell you that there's a lot of AV tools that still won't catch that. But the general principle is you need to get the live memory out of the LSASS process. That's where the stuff is going to be that you want if you want to steal their credentials. I thought that I would also quickly mention the concept of a malicious password filter. So this is a domain attack, and it has a different MITRE. It's MITRE 1556002, which is specifically just for a malicious password filter. So in an Active Directory domain, you can have a password filter, which is a DLL that gets loaded, that will check to see whether or not your passwords that your users are changing are on some kind of bad list. So as an example, we would put Gamecocks as something that somebody should never be able to put as their password, because it's too easy to figure out that somebody that goes to USC would have Gamecocks as the password. We also might put Tigers or, you know, whatever, Wildcats, since we got beaten by Kentucky horribly last week. But in general, if you can create a malicious password filter, they would basically write everything off somewhere else. So I changed my password to Go Clemson. It writes it off to a file somewhere. That would be used for stealth. You know, a ransomware attacker wouldn't use a malicious password filter. Somebody that wants to stay on the net, that by design would stay on the network a long time, would use something like that. All right, so this is the most interesting current one to me. In Windows 7, there's a new global flag that was added that's called silent process exit. So when a process in Windows exits, there's a new flag that can be hooked to do a choice of 3 different things. One of them is it can be used to launch a process. It can do a mini dump, or it can pop up some kind of notification. So it seems like the first people that were investigating this were using it for persistence. So you get your evil code on the machine, you kill the process, and then for persistence purposes, at that process's death, a new process gets started. So that's the launch monitor process thing. In our case, what you would do is you would set LSASS to mini dump to a file on process exit. So the reason that you would want to do something like that primarily is to get around detection, because it's not, your process isn't calling anything into LSASS to cause it to dump memory. It's doing it itself. So in that scenario, you would want to look for LSASS dump files. That seems to be the current quote-unquote cool one. And there's a company called Deep Instinct, some researchers, Deep Instinct, who have an excellent Medium article, I believe, or maybe it's on their website. So if you just look up Deep Instinct LSASS dump, they talk about using silent process exit for an attack. All right, so remember at the beginning I said Microsoft doesn't do any of this stuff for you. They have written a lot of stuff into the OS, but none of them are turned on until you start messing with it, with the exception of the wdigest thing. So wdigest, we don't need to get into too much detail, but it's an older way of doing things. Everything's plain text and memory, all that kind of stuff. If you use things like the CIS secure configuration baselines or STIGs or whatever, there are going to be things in there about debug rights. That kind of stuff is for defense in depth. And to me, one of the interesting things is why does the CIS benchmark say that only administrators should have debug rights when the vast majority of the time, you don't necessarily need that either. Um, Somebody that has admin rights is probably going to be able to do privilege escalation to system anyway, so don't even let administrators do debug. However, you should obviously test that in your environment. This gets back to my sister's lawyer's office also. They have no idea what run as PPL is, and there's a lot of people that don't know this, even Windows admins. And your Windows admin, system administrator, help desk people, that is actually the first security step in all of this Windows stuff. A competent Windows administrator is worth tons of people on our side doing detection, right? Because if that's done properly, then the investment is there, then we in the SOC don't have to do as much, theoretically. But half of them that I've talked to don't know what run as PPO is. It was introduced in Vista, and it's run as Protected Process Light. You can look up the MSDN article about what exactly the different protection levels are, but one of them specifically has to do with LSASS, and there's a registry key that is not on by default that you turn on. So all it is run as PPL 1. And what that does is it basically stops certain DLLs from being able to load into LSASS, stopping process injection. However, if you do something like run Duo and you have old DLLs or any kind of third-party authentication that you hook in Windows, it has to be Windows qualified, and if you try and do old stuff, it'll bomb. So it has to be tested. Credential Guard was something that was introduced in Windows 10, which is primarily, well, only works with domain accounts. It is one of these things that Microsoft has come out with in the last 6 or 7 years that use virtualization in order to protect something. So there's Application Guard, Device Guard, Credential Guard, some other kind of guard, I'm sure. Credential Guard abstracts out LSASS into an isolated container where only certain activities can happen and you can't directly read it. However, there is a Mimikatz driver that can do some of this kind of stuff. So you have to be really careful, and all of these controls are additive, and you have to test them in your environment and all that kind of stuff. So the main thing that I want y'all to do is to know that this stuff is there, because there's a lot of people that they just have no idea. Or if you come across this in something like the secure configuration baseline documents for something, this is why. You don't want processes to be able to inject into LSASS because of the stuff that's stored in LSASS memory. There's another thing which gets to what I was talking about. Microsoft will do more for you if you pay, right? They're a services company, in addition to being a software company. So in the E3 licensing, E3, A3, G3, and above, for M365, you get some additional what are called attack surface reduction rules, ASR. One of them is don't let bad stuff happen to LSASS. I don't remember what the exact name is, but that's basically what it comes down to. Only allow certain Microsoft vetted DLLs process to connect to LSASS. Obviously, this has to be tested, which is a repeated thing. But if you don't pay, you get no management tools in order to test all this stuff. So you can turn it on in audit mode, and it'll write out and say, ubkey.dll connected to LSASS, duo.blah, blah, blah, DLL connected to LSASS. And then you can turn it on, and it'll block it if it doesn't meet Microsoft's specification. Has to be signed, go through the driver quality thing with Microsoft, all that kind of stuff. But if you don't pay, you have to do it through group policy in the registry, and it's not pretty. So there's a big debate amongst people that do Microsoft stuff about when is it they're going to start taking some of these security technologies and moving them down into the lower licensing levels. And I think it's unfortunate, but it's because they can make money off of them, partially because they're a services company. All right, so for detection purposes, if you run Mimikatz and you haven't turned off Defender, or even, you're using Symantec or whatever, it's probably going to get caught. So don't get in the habit of turning off AV. It's the layered defense thing, all that kind of stuff. If you're not familiar with Sysmon, you need to know what it is, even if you don't use it, because the concept is becoming like the MITRE framework. If I talk to somebody, I expect for them to know what Sysmon is if they're a defender, because it's becoming standard. Mark Rusunovich they're working on a version for Linux, which maybe is going to replace some of the stuff in AutoD and all that kind of stuff. So Microsoft is putting, since they bought sysinternals whenever it was, they're putting a lot of investment into this kind of stuff. And actually, if you have the good fortune of running E5 or A5 or G5 or whatever, and you run Defender for Endpoint, what used to be called Defender ATP, all of that telemetry is coming kind of from Sysmon. So the stuff that you're going to be looking for then is event ID 10 in Sysmon. But we don't have enough time to get into all the details about that. But basically, you want to look for something injecting itself into LSASS to do something. If you have the money to run EDR, that's a good way to do detections, obviously, but things have to be tweaked. One of the things that I've been talking about is how you have to test things and come back to it. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention Detection Lab. So there's a gentleman named Chris Long, whose Twitter handle is Centurion, who has a set of VMs that can be created with Vagrant and Packer. And I think there's Terraform for doing it in AWS and maybe some Azure stuff. It sets up a domain, sets up Splunk, Sysmon, a couple of clients, and you can test all this stuff. Comes with Atomic Red Team. So if there are Red Canary people here, I know today. So Atomic Red Team is an awesome way to test this kind of stuff. One of the things also is to start thinking about maturity and how do you move from I don't know anything about this stuff at all to moving up a maturity scale or whatever you want to talk about, where what you're really doing is determining what is normal for my environment and what isn't normal. And one of the things that has to be based off of is iteration. So these techniques change over time, and none of this stuff, unfortunately, to go back to the debug rights, run as PPL, all that, those are never going to go away probably. However, new techniques come out, new tools get turned on from Microsoft's perspective. So I'm not a GRC person at all, but if you have GRC kind of people, they need to put this in the rotation of stuff. We need to come back every year and run Atomic Red Team and see if there's new tests for dumping LSASS, something like that. But one of my pet peeves is the thought that these kinds of things can be like a light switch, like LSASS is protected now, which you can't do that with basically anything. All of these have to go into iterations, which also allows you to move toward underlying principles, which is one of the things that the MITRE ATT&CK framework helps with. So the underlying principle here is that LSASS memory is going to get dumped. And at a certain point, does it matter what technique somebody uses in order to dump LSASS memory? Or is it the fact that they're dumping the memory is the important thing? right? So people write, I don't know, there's one called sharp dumper, I think, which is written in C sharp. So you can recompile it every day, new hash, etc. So something that's looking for the hash of Mimikatz or whatever won't catch it. However, if it's going to dump, it has to talk to LSASS, has to get the memory out of there, and the memory has to go somewhere. So that's what I'm talking about, underlying principles. So the registry key to do the silent process exit still has to dump the memory. Sharp dumper still has to dump memory, Win32 API, all that kind of stuff. And you know why people were trying to get this is because they want to do lateral movement. So you also want to use preventive controls like lapse, if you're not familiar with that, to randomize the local admin passwords on all your machines. Jason Fawson, who's a SANS instructor or SANS fellow or whatever level he's at, has some awesome PowerShell scripts to do that also. However, there was a discussion, I believe, on Tuesday on Twitter where Florian Roth, who is one of the inventors of Sigma, which y'all should also know about, is just because you're going to detect the method doesn't mean that you have to stop detecting tools. So detecting netcat by hash is much faster than detecting an arbitrary port that gets created. Like, how in the world are you going to figure out what created an arbitrary port unless you're doing OSSEC or something and looking for new ports listening and all that kind of stuff? So unfortunately, even if you're getting toward detecting the method, detecting tools is faster. And a lot of these things are known. So our jobs, unfortunately, are not easy. And as I said, there's no light switch that you can switch. It's a process, an iterative process. So I know that that was a lot because we had to get all this done in a very short period of time. So I wanted to give you quite a number of Twitter accounts that you can follow. Clement Labro has written the best thing that I've ever seen about protected process light, where he goes into how can you actually get around it in user mode without having admin rights. There's a bunch of cool stuff. The Red Canary threat detection report will go into, where is this, and the DBIR, where is this technique, in the top 10, all that kind of, unfortunately, people need credentials. So even if this is not in the top 10, it's never going away, and it gets abused all the time. All right? So my contact stuff's down at the bottom, FR Columba on Twitter, and infosec@epipsyche.org. So I have 2 minutes, a minute, something like that. I will ask a question, and then y'all can ask me maybe one question. And Captain Marvel here will take this to whoever can answer this question. So what version of Windows was Protected Process Light introduced? Yes, yep, Vista. All right. So that's an alpha adapter, I think a Wi-Fi adapter. Should be cool. All right, so does anyone have any questions in the 30 seconds or so that I have? I will say it doesn't appear that there are any USC students in here, but if there are, please talk to me because our SOC is run by students, and if I don't know you and you go to USC, I would like to meet you. So I'll be outside.